Black boy saves a racist who hated him. What he learns about him will shock you. The sun was setting over the small southern town of Willow Creek, casting long shadows over the worn-down buildings that line the streets. The town, nestled between rolling hills and vast cotton fields, had a history as old as the country itself. Some parts of that history, however, were better left in the past. For as long as anyone could remember, Willow Creek had been divided. Not by fences or walls, but by something much harder to break: generations of prejudice and unspoken rules. On one side of town, the Black community lived in closely packed houses, working tirelessly to make ends meet. On the other side, the wealthier white families resided in grand, historic homes, passing down their legacy with pride. Among the town's many inhabitants was 13-year-old Jamal Carter. A bright and kind-hearted boy, Jamal had dreams bigger than the dusty roads of Willow Creek. He lived with his mother, Angela, a hard-working nurse who had raised him alone since his father's passing. Jamal was known for his infectious smile and an unwavering sense of hope, despite the harsh realities he faced daily. One of those harsh realities was Thomas Grayson. Thomas was a retired war veteran, a man as bitter as he was old. Wrinkles creased his sun-scarred face, and his eyes carried the weight of a past he never spoke about. He lived in a decaying white house on the far end of town, alone and angry at the world. But what made him infamous was his deep-seated hatred, especially for people like Jamal. Grayson had spent decades harboring resentment, refusing to let go of the beliefs that had been instilled in him since childhood. He avoided Black folks, refused to speak to them unless absolutely necessary, and made it clear that their presence in his town was unwelcome. His interactions with Jamal were no different. Every time the boy rode past his house on his rusty bicycle, Grayson would glare, spit, or mutter a slur under his breath. Jamal, though hurt, never let it deter him. Some people carry hate like it's the only thing keeping them alive, his mother had once told him. But that doesn't mean you have to carry it, too. Still, it wasn't easy. Knowing someone despised him for something as simple as the color of his skin made Jamal's stomach churn. He often wondered what had made Mr. Grayson so hateful. Was it something that had happened in his past? Or was he just born that way? Then came the day that changed everything. It was mid-August, the thick, humid air clinging to Jamal's skin as he rode his bike through the narrow roads of Willow Creek. He had just finished running an errand for his mother when he heard the faintest sound carried by the wind, a groan, low and pained. Jamal slowed his bike, glancing around. At first, he thought he had imagined it. But then he heard it again, this time clearer. A weak, strained voice calling for help. It was coming from the overgrown ditch beside the road. Curiosity and concern gnawed at him as he cautiously approached. Pushing aside the thick brush, his breath caught in his throat. There, lying in the ditch, was Thomas Grayson. The old man's face was twisted in pain, his clothes dirted and torn. One of his legs lay at an awkward angle, and sweat dripped down his forehead. His usually sharp, hate-filled eyes were now filled with something Jamal had never seen in them before: fear. "Help," Grayson wheezed, his voice barely above a whisper. Jamal hesitated. This was the same man who had spent years making his life miserable. The same man who had called him slurs, spat at the ground when he walked by, and refused to treat him with an ounce of respect. A dozen thoughts swirled in Jamal's head. He could leave. No one would blame him. The old man had never shown him kindness, so why should he return the favor? But then he heard his mother's voice in his head. We don't choose who we help based on who deserves it. We help because it's the right thing to do. Swallowing his pride, Jamal knelt beside the old man. "I'm gonna get you out of here, Mr. Grayson," he said, voice steady. The old man's eyes widened slightly, as if he couldn't believe that this black boy, whom he had mistreated for years, was the one offering him a lifeline. Jamal didn't wait for permission. He dug his heels into the dirt, bracing himself as he carefully maneuvered Grayson's weight onto his back. The old man groaned in agony, but Jamal gritted his teeth and pressed on. Each step was grueling. The ditch was deep, the incline steep. Sweat poured down Jamal's face as he carried the frail but surprisingly heavy man up the slope. By the time they reached level ground, his muscles screamed in protest. "Hold on, I'm gonna get help," Jamal panted, gently laying Grayson down on the grass before pulling out his old flip phone. He dialed 911 with shaking fingers. As he waited for the ambulance, he glanced at the old man. For the first time, Grayson wasn't glaring or muttering insults. He was just staring at Jamal, something unreadable in his tired eyes. "Why?" Grayson finally croaked. "Why'd you help me?" Jamal wiped his forehead, catching his breath. "Because you needed it." Silence hung between them. And then, for the first time in all the years Jamal had known him, Grayson nodded. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible. But in that moment, something shifted. Jamal didn't know what Grayson had gone through to become the man he was, but he knew one thing. Hate wasn't the strongest thing in the world. Not even close. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different. Jamal's heart pounded as he stared at the old man in the hospital bed. The man who had cursed him, chased him off his property, and hurled slurs at him was now unconscious, his body battered from the accident. The irony wasn't lost on Jamal. He had saved the life of a man who wouldn't have thought twice about turning him away if the roles were reversed. The doctors had informed him that Mr. Langston, the elderly man, had suffered a severe concussion and a fractured leg. While his life was no longer in immediate danger, the road to recovery would be long and grueling. Jamal, unsure why he still lingered in the waiting room, couldn't shake the strange pull he felt toward the man. Then, as if fate had decided to add another layer to the puzzle, a nurse walked up to Jamal, her expression hesitant. "Are you family?" she asked. Jamal hesitated. "No, he keeps calling out for someone named Matthew in his sleep. I don't see any family listed in his records. Do you know if he has a son?" Jamal shook his head. "I have no idea." The nurse sighed. "Well, if no one comes forward, he'll have no one to take care of him once he's discharged." Jamal left the hospital that night, but his mind was restless. He knew he had no obligation to this man, yet something inside him refused to let it go. He started asking around the neighborhood about Mr. Langston's past, about this mysterious Matthew. T was Mrs. Turner, an elderly woman who had lived in the area for decades, who finally provided some insight. "Matthew was his son," she said, her wrinkled hands trembling as she stirred her tea. "But he's been gone for years." Jamal frowned. "Gone? What do you mean?" Mrs. Turner hesitated.
"Dead."
"Died in a fire. It broke Henry, Mr. Langston. He was never the same after that." Jamal felt his stomach drop. He had assumed Mr. Langston was just another bitter old racist, but now he saw the pain beneath the anger. Could it be that the man had shut himself off from the world after losing his son? Fueled by an odd sense of duty, Jamal returned to the hospital, determined to speak to Mr. Langston once he woke up. When Mr. Langston finally opened his eyes, his gaze landed on Jamal, and his face contorted with a mix of confusion and anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" he spat, his voice hoarse. Jamal crossed his arms. "I saved your life." Mr. Langston scoffed. "And what, you want a medal?" Jamal clenched his jaw.
"No."
"But you should know I didn't have to. I could have left you there. But I didn't." The old man's expression darkened, but something flickered in his eyes, something almost like shame. He turned his head away, staring at the ceiling. "I didn't ask for your help." "No," Jamal agreed, "but you needed it." There was silence between them. Then, barely above a whisper, Mr. Langston said, "You should have let me die." Jamal stiffened. "Why would you say that?" The old man didn't respond. Instead, he shut his eyes, dismissing him. But Jamal wasn't done. Determined to understand Mr. Langston's bitterness, Jamal started digging deeper. He searched through public records and even visited the abandoned remains of the house that had burned down years ago. What he found shocked him to his core. The fire that had killed Matthew wasn't an accident. Jamal discovered an old newspaper clipping buried in the archives. It spoke of a suspected arson, but no one had been charged. The article mentioned racial tensions in the area at the time, hinting that the fire might have been a hate crime. Could that be why Mr. Langston hated Jamal? Was it because his son had been taken from him by people who looked like Jamal? Jamal returned to the hospital, gripping the article in his hand. Mr. Langston was awake, staring blankly at the window. "You hated me because I reminded you of them, didn't you?" Jamal said, his voice steady. The old man turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jamal held up the newspaper. "Your son didn't die in an accident. He was murdered." For the first time, Jamal saw genuine pain cross Mr. Langston's face. His hands trembled. "I know," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Jamal's breath caught. "You knew?" The old man's face contorted. "I knew. But the men who did it, they got away with it. They walked free. And no one cared." His voice cracked. "And every time I saw someone like you, I saw them. The ones who burned my boy alive." Jamal's heart ached. "I'm not them." Mr. Langston's lips pressed into a thin line. "I know that. But hate, it's like poison. Once you drink it, it spreads. I let it fester for too long." Silence stretched between them. Then, in a voice so raw it was almost inaudible, Mr. Langston said, "I'm sorry." Jamal exhaled. He hadn't expected an apology. And yet, hearing it felt like a weight lifting off both of them. Mr. Langston had no family left, and with no one to care for him after his release, Jamal made a choice that stunned even himself. He decided to help him. It wasn't easy. The old man was stubborn, prideful, and reluctant to accept kindness from the very person he had once despised. But over time, something shifted. Jamal started bringing him meals. They watched old baseball games together. They talked, really talked. Mr. Langston told stories of his childhood, of Matthew's laughter, of the life he had lost. And slowly, the hate that had consumed him for decades began to fade. But just when it seemed like healing was possible, a new obstacle emerged, one that would test their fragile bond in a way neither had expected. Jamal had thought the hardest part of helping Mr. Langston was behind him. The old man had begun to soften, even showing glimpses of warmth in moments he probably didn't realize. But just when things seemed to be turning a corner, a storm neither of them expected was about to strike. It started with a knock on the door. Jamal opened it to find two men standing on the porch, their expressions unreadable. One was in his 50s, burly, with a grizzled beard. The other was younger, mid-30s, with sharp eyes that darted toward Mr. Langston, who sat in his wheelchair near the window. "You Henry Langston?" the older man asked, his voice rough. Mr. Langston turned, his expression immediately darkening. "Who's asking?" The younger man stepped forward. "My name's David Spencer." He hesitated. "My father was one of the men who was there the night your house burned down." Silence fell over the room like a suffocating blanket. Jamal felt his chest tighten. He looked at Mr. Langston, expecting him to explode, to lash out. Instead, the old man was eerily still, his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck bulged. David swallowed hard.
"He's dying," he said.
"And before he goes, he wanted me to find you, to tell you the truth." "The truth?" Mr. Langston's voice was sharp as broken glass. "What truth?" David exhaled. "The fire. It wasn't supposed to happen that way." Jamal felt anger rise in his own chest. "Not supposed to happen? What kind of excuse was that?" David continued, his voice strained. "They wanted to scare you. My father and his friends, they never meant for the fire to spread like it did. They thought the house was empty." Mr. Langston's hands trembled against the arms of his wheelchair. "And that's supposed to make it better? My son, my boy, died in that fire." His voice cracked with raw grief, making Jamal's stomach twist. David's face was filled with guilt. "I know. And I'm not here asking for forgiveness. I couldn't let my father take this secret to his grave. You deserve to know." For a long time, Mr. Langston said nothing. His breath came in shallow gasps, and for a terrifying moment, Jamal thought he might actually collapse under the weight of it all. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the old man asked, "What do you want from me?" David's jaw tightened. "I just needed to tell you. But also, I heard you don't have anyone left. No family." His eyes flickered toward Jamal. I know this doesn't mean anything, but if you ever need help, Mr. Langston let out a bitter laugh. You think I'd take help from the son of the man who killed mine? David lowered his gaze.
No.
But I had to offer. Then, he nodded once and walked away, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the air before a storm. That night, something changed in Mr. Langston. He barely spoke. He refused to eat. The fire in his eyes, the one that had raged for so long, fueled by hatred, grief, and pain, had dimmed into something hollow. Jamal didn't know how to help him. You gotta eat something, Mr. Langston. The old man shook his head. What's the point? Jamal sighed, frustration creeping in. The point is you're still alive. You got a second chance. Mr. Langston scoffed. For what? To be an old, broken man in a wheelchair? To know my son's killers got to live their lives while he never got to grow up? Jamal hesitated before sitting down across from him. You said it yourself, hate is poison. If you let it keep eating at you, you might as well have died with your son. The words were harsh, but they needed to be said. Mr. Langston looked at him, something flickering in his eyes. You really believe that? Jamal nodded.
Yeah.
And I think Matthew wouldn't want you to waste the time you have left. For the first time in days, something shifted in the old man's expression. Not a full transformation, but the smallest crack in the wall he had built around himself. The next evening, Jamal went to grab groceries. He was only gone for 30 minutes. But when he returned, smoke was billowing from the house. Panic surged through him. Mr. Langston. Without hesitation, he sprinted inside. Flames licked at the walls, the air thick with black smoke. Coughing, Jamal covered his mouth and rushed toward the living room where Mr. Langston had been sitting. The old man was slumped in his wheelchair, struggling to move. His face was pale, sweat dripping down his temples. Jamal didn't think, he just acted. He grabbed the wheelchair and pushed, but the wheels caught on something. Come on, he muttered, his lungs burning. The fire crackled louder, embers falling from the ceiling. Then, suddenly, a beam collapsed behind them, sending sparks flying. Jamal threw his body over Mr. Langston, shielding him from the falling debris. He gritted his teeth against the searing heat, his mind screaming at him to move. With all the strength he had left, he lifted Mr. Langston into his arms and staggered toward the door. The heat was unbearable, sweat and ash mixing on his skin. Finally, he burst through the front door, stumbling onto the grass just as the neighbors ran toward them. Firefighters arrived minutes later, but by then, the house was lost. Jamal lay on his back, gasping for air. Mr. Langston coughed beside him, eyes wide as he stared at the burning wreckage. For the second time, Jamal had saved his life. And this time, something in the old man finally broke. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at Jamal, his voice hoarse. Why? Jamal wiped the soot from his brow. Because you deserve to be saved. The next morning, Mr. Langston was quiet. Not in the defeated way he had been before, but in a contemplative silence. Jamal sat beside him on the hospital bed. You all right? The old man exhaled. I don't know. But I know one thing. He turned his gaze toward Jamal.
I was wrong about you.
About a lot of things. Jamal didn't say anything. He let Mr. Langston find his own words. I spent so long being angry, he admitted. Hating a world that took my boy away. And I thought holding on to that hate gave me purpose. But all it did was make me blind. He looked down at his trembling hands. And then you, a kid I wanted nothing to do with, saved my life. Twice. Jamal gave a small, tired smile. Guess you're stuck with me now. Mr. Langston let out a raspy chuckle. Guess I am. There was a long pause before the old man spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Jamal nodded, knowing this was the start of something new, not just for Mr. Langston, but for both of them. Because forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about choosing to move forward. And for the first time in decades, Mr. Langston finally took that step. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of nurses passing in the hallway. Jamal sat beside Mr. Langston's bed, watching the old man stare at the ceiling, deep in thought. The fire had taken everything, the house, the memories, the past, but in some strange way, it had also freed them both. For the first time, Mr. Langston wasn't a man chained to his hatred. For the first time, Jamal wasn't just a boy proving himself to someone who didn't want to see him. They were just two people, bound together by something neither of them had expected. After the fire, the town had come together in a way Jamal had never seen before. The very people who had once ignored or dismissed Mr. Langston suddenly showed up, bringing blankets, food, and even offering places for him to stay. It turned out, despite his bitterness, people still cared. Mrs. Johnson, the kind old woman from the church, had taken it upon herself to organize a fundraiser. "That man may have been stubborn as a mule," she told Jamal, "but he's one of us. And we don't let our own suffer." Jamal had barely left Mr. Langston's side in the hospital. Not because he felt obligated, but because he wanted to be there. "You know," Mr. Langston murmured one evening, breaking the silence, "I spent my whole life thinking the world owed me something. That if I was bitter enough, angry enough, it would somehow fix what was broken." Jamal leaned forward, listening. "But I was wrong." Mr. Langston swallowed. "Hating didn't bring my son back. It didn't heal anything. It just made sure I was alone." His eyes, once filled with so much fire, now softened as they met Jamal's. "And then you, this kid I spent months pushing away, showed me what kindness really looks like." Jamal felt something stir in his chest. A quiet pride. Mr. Langston hesitated. "I know I can't change the past. But if you let me, I'd like to change how this ends." Jamal raised a brow. "What do you mean?" "I don't have much time left, son." His voice was rough, but not sad. Just honest. "And I don't have a family. But you've been more of a grandson to me than I ever deserved." He paused. "Would you let an old fool make things right?" Jamal's throat tightened.
"Yeah," he said.
"Yeah, I would." And just like that, something shifted between them a week later. As Mr. Langston grew stronger, they sat outside the hospital, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft golds and purples. "I want to tell you something," Mr. Langston said, his voice quiet. "About that night. The fire." Jamal turned to him, surprised. "I used to think it was just about race," the old man admitted. "That they hated me because I was a black man daring to own land in a town that didn't want me there." He let out a long breath. "But I learned something else." Jamal's brows furrowed.
"What?"
"The fire wasn't an accident," Mr. Langston said, his jaw tightening. "And it wasn't just some drunk men making a mistake." He looked at Jamal. "It was planned." Jamal's stomach dropped. "What do you mean planned?" "There were people in power, men who wanted my land. They sent those men to drive me out. But when my family didn't leave fast enough, he trailed off, his voice heavy with grief." Jamal's hands clenched. "And they got away with it?" Mr. Langston nodded. "For decades, yeah. But not anymore." Jamal frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've been talking to a lawyer," the old man admitted. "That fire was covered up, but the truth's still out there. And I'm going to make sure it comes out before I go." Jamal exhaled. "You think people will care after all these years?" Mr. Langston gave a tired smile. "They'll care when they realize the same people who did this to me built this town on other folks' suffering. And if I can make sure my son's death wasn't for nothing, then I'll finally be at peace." Jamal nodded, something fierce burning in his chest. "Then I'll help." And for the first time, Mr. Langston didn't argue. More than blood asterisk, the months that followed were a whirlwind. The lawsuit, the media attention, the way people finally started talking about the things the town had buried for so long. Through it all, Jamal stayed by Mr. Langston's side. They never spoke about it out loud, but they both knew the truth. Mr. Langston didn't have much time left. The years of bitterness had taken a toll, and though he fought, his body was growing weaker. But he didn't die bitter. He didn't die alone. On a quiet spring morning, with Jamal sitting beside him, Mr. Langston took one last breath and left the world with peace in his eyes. Jamal sat there for a long time after, holding the old man's hand, feeling the weight of everything they had been through. And for the first time, he realized something. Family wasn't just about blood. It was about who showed up. who stayed. And in the end, Jamal and Mr. Langston had been family in every way that mattered. Weeks after the funeral, Jamal stood in front of a brand new building, the Matthew Langston Community Center. Funded by the lawsuit, built on the truth Mr. Langston had fought so hard to reveal, it was a place for kids like Jamal. For people who needed a second chance. For people who needed someone to believe in them. Jamal looked up at the sign and smiled. The past had tried to break them. But in the end, love had won. And that was the legacy Mr. Langston left behind.